Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our annual Copernicus lecture. I'm thrilled to have a nice crowd, a mix of faculty, students, friends of the center. Every year we hold this lecture, and it's our special event of the year. So welcome, and we're really happy to host such a distinguished guest, Professor Wojciech Sadurski, who's going to be speaking about Poland a few years ago, Poland today. But I think that many of you in the room are interested in Poland, but also perhaps in what is going on in the US today. So I think that there's things for us to consider, and that Professor Sadurski's expertise will help us think about contemporary issues here in the US by thinking and knowing about the Polish case. So my name is Janša Zubrzicki. I'm the director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, and I'm also the Weiser Family Professor of European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Michigan. The Copernicus Center was established in 1973 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus' birth, Mikołaj Kopernik. The center funds student scholarships and faculty grants. It sponsors courses on a variety of Polish topics, and it organizes the annual Copernicus Lecture to bring some of Poland's most impactful scholars, thinkers, artists, and political figures to Ann Arbor. And just to name a few, to brag a little bit about what we've accomplished in the past 50 years, former Copernicus lectures were delivered by philosophers and poets Leszek Kołakowski, Czesław Miłosz, and Adam Zagajewski, conductors Krzysztof Penderecki and Henryk Górecki, artists Krzysztof Wodiczko, Stasis, Manam Skora, Agnieszka Holland, and Tomasz Stańko. We also hosted Polish public intellectuals and scholars such as Adam Michnik and Adam Rotfeld, Artur Żmijewski, Dorota Masłowska, Anda Rottenberg, and recently Katarzyna Pełczyńska-Nałęcz. Last but not least, we were visited by former presidents Aleksander Kwaśniewski and Lech Wałęsa. And last fall, we were very happy to host the mayor of Poland, of Warsaw, but who's now the frontrunner of Poland's presidential race, Rafał Trzaskowski. So tonight we have the privilege to host Wojciech Sadurski, who is the Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney and Professor at the University of Warsaw Center for Europe. He's a lawyer, political philosopher, and commentator on public affairs. He previously held the chair in philosophy of law at the European University Institute in Florence, and he has taught regularly at Yale, NYU, and Princeton. Professor Sadurski's most recent books include Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, published in 2019, then A Pandemic of Populists in 2022, and Constitutional Public Reason in 2023. In 2023, he received the Polish Academy of Arts and Sciences in America, PIASA, distinguished award, the Karol Pilarczyk Award, for his promotion of democracy and the rule of law. For over a century, then, the Copernicus Center has brought Poland to Ann Arbor and established itself as the premier center for Polish studies in North America. And so we're very proud tonight to host Professor Wojciech Sadurski, and please join me in offering him a very warm Michigan welcome.
My very, very big thanks to Professor Genevieve Zubrzicki and to her entire team. For me, it's immense pleasure and honor to be speaking to you today. I can't really think of any other academic entity in the world outside Poland who would come even close in its prominence and in its achievements to the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies and to the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. So I'm really humbled by the names that Professor Zubrzycki listed as my predecessor. And as an evidence of my recognition and my gratitude for inviting me, let me quote a mail message which I have just received from my friend and very important scholar, an Australian Polish scholar, Professor Martin Krieger. Yesterday, I shared with him my joy about being invited here and sent him a little poster. And Martin, who last year delivered a prominent annual Adam Smith lecture in Glasgow, responded immediately in the following way. And I'm quoting him, I should say, without his permission because of the time difference between the US and Australia, so please don't quote him. He said this: Copernicus, 3 exclamation marks. The best I got to was Adam Smith, and I was pretty amazed by that. So my status is demeaned by you once more. No news in that. So as you see, I probably have lost a friend in the process, but I believe that by being a visitor here, I'm a net winner or gainer. Now, let me, as my motto or epigraph for this lecture, let me quote a slightly paraphrased passage from a famous at the time book by Clay Sharkey. Here come, actually, I'm sorry, I have misspelled his surname there, called Here Comes Everybody. And with a paraphrase, which doesn't change the nature of his passage, it would now read the following: real restorations of democracy don't involve an orderly transition from point A to point B. Rather, they go from A through a long period of chaos and only then reach B. In that chaotic period, the old systems get broken long before new ones become stable. And it is as good description of what is going on in Poland now and what has been going on for the last year and 3 months as one can find. It is a period of chaos which doesn't resemble in any way a nice, clear, direct road from A to B. But before I go into more detailed account of what is going on now and how to characterize this transition, let me emphasize that what happened on October 15, 2023 in Poland was a real miracle. And when I say miracle, I don't have in mind anything particularly metaphysical or transcendental. It's a very down-to-earth use of the word, in the sense that it was a clear deviation, a positive deviation, of course, but a clear deviation from an overall pattern of populist authoritarianisms around the world. Because over the past years, ruling populist authoritarians presented themselves, submitted themselves to free and to some extent fair elections in a number of states in which they ruled. And let me say as a digression, that in parentheses, that when I use the concept of populist authoritarians, I use it in a way in which both the adjective and the noun are equally important, because not all authoritarianisms are populist. No one would call probably Lukashenko or Putin or Assad a populist, and not all populists are authoritarian. Probably current Italian Prime Minister, Ms. Meloni, is populist, but not particularly authoritarian, not so far anyway. So populist authoritarianism is not a tautology, it's not a repetition. It is really very important to understand its very, very special character. So going back to my thought, they presented themselves to various elections, and we may distinguish two categories of these elections: those in which the ruling populist authoritarians won, thus gaining their re-election, and those in which they lost. So the first sub-bullet point lists some of the victorious or winning authoritarian populists, with the incumbent winning the elections. In Hungary, for example, in 2022, in Turkey, or in India. Orban, Erdogan, and Modi won their re-elections. And there were some cases of populist authoritarians which where the incumbents lost and stepped down and surrendered their power. Israel 2021, Netanyahu lost to anti-Netanyahu coalition, although for a rather short time. Donald Trump in the US in 2020, perhaps most significantly, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2022. And now, if we put aside for a moment, but only for a moment, the case of Poland, we see that there is a certain clear regularity here. And the regularity is the populists lost when they haven't, in any dramatic way, dismantled institutional structure of democracy. As some political scientists call it, they were undisciplined authoritarians. They didn't even try very hard to, say, peg the courts or control electoral system, etc. While populist authoritarians won, and that's not surprising, in those circumstances in which in their recent, and sometimes in too recent terms of office, they have thoroughly dismantled the institutional infrastructure of democracy, as Orban did in Hungary, as Modi did in India, and as Erdogan did in Turkey. So we may have a rule, if you like, a political scientist rule: populist authoritarians win when they succeeded to thoroughly dismantle, break down the pre-existing structure of democracy. Right? Wrong, because Poland is a big exception or big negation of that alleged regularity. In Poland, the structure of democracy has been very, very fundamentally and comprehensively dismantled by Law and Justice Party, Polish acronym PiS, which I'll be using now because it's well known internationally. And it was a comprehensive destruction of democratic system. Everything they touched, they managed to subjugate, or at least to a large degree, to their will. Constitutional Tribunal, National Council of Judiciary, Common Courts, Board of Media and Public Media, Electoral Commission, Civil Service. You mention, they managed to erode it from its original constitutional purposes. And yet they've lost. And they've lost not marginally, as Trump did in 2020 here, or Netanyahu in 2021 in Israel, or even as Bolsonaro in 2022, where the margin of victory of Lula was very, very small. In Poland, democratic opposition won decisively over PiS. The three parties which constituted a relatively loose democratic coalition got 53% of votes, while PiS in the end got 35% of votes. That's a huge difference, which is reflected in a relatively safe majority in the parliament. Not sufficient to amend the constitution, but certainly sufficient to run a legislative program of the new majority, if only the president didn't veto many of its bills. And so I'm not going, because it's not my purpose in this lecture to go into the sources and the pedigree of this amazing victory. What I'm going to do is to suggest that this path dependence, as social scholars say, this situation of inheriting from the former rulers, from the incumbents, an institutional field which is so thoroughly eroded of its democratic features, is the main factor in understanding the situation in Poland today and the situation that has been going on since 15th December. Because that's the day when 13th December, when the current ruling opposition took, current ruling majority took power. I think that one helpful way at looking at the main dilemmas of post-populism in Poland today is to compare today's transition to the post-communist transition of 1989 and immediately after. And the comparison is legitimate because both these transitions have the same vector. They both aim at either establishing or restoring democracy. But there are some very important differences between these two transitions. And these differences can be, we can have a taxonomy of these differences in a way which shows to what extent today's transition is easier than post-1989 transition, but also the second category, which is particularly troubling for us today, of the differences which render today's transition in some ways much more difficult and problematic than the post-communist change. So, starting with the first category of differences, those which render today's transition so much easier than post-1989, I list mainly three characteristics. First of all, after the round table and the first semi-free elections to the parliament, to Polish Sejm, Polish lower chamber, as it was then, because the Senate was added later, in 1989, is that it wasn't clear what is the finalité, as the French say. What is the target point? What is this B, if we think about the move from A to B? And there were all sorts of projects and templates and blueprints on the table, but there wasn't any particular certainty about which of these blueprints should be actually achieved. And there were and including among constitutional lawyers, and I am a constitutional scholar, so this is my main interest, it wasn't really quite clear what sort of examples from the democratic world should Polish system promote, or should it find its own sui generis, its own original templates. Well, today, the situation is relatively clear. We are talking about restoration of the rule of law, restoration of democracy, re-democratization. So in a sense, the finalité today is quite clear. It is what was until 2015. Well, not exactly, of course, because to try to recreate now the Polish democracy of 2015 would be to recreate democracy which showed itself to be quite vulnerable to the assault by populists. But by and large, we are talking about restoration rather than invention of something new. The second difference is that at that stage, in 1989, there wasn't any constitutional blueprint. There wasn't any constitutional document which would provide an institutional framework for the state. the constitution of the constitution of Polish People's Republic wasn't worth the paper on which it was printed. So we didn't have an institutional framework such as we have now. And I believe that Polish constitution of 1997 is reasonably good. I mean, there are a few marginal things which should be strengthened in order to strengthen the checks and balances. But by and large, it's a good blueprint, except that it was completely disregarded and breached by peace. But this is something that no constitution can be immune to. And the third difference is that at that point, in 1989, Poland wasn't part of any important supranational structure or entity, similar to what is now, that we are member state of the European Union, we are member state of the Council of Europe, and we are a member state of NATO, although these days it's not quite clear to what extent NATO membership really provides strong guarantees also for maintenance of democracy with the new policy of President Donald Trump. But more troublesome category of differences are those which render, perhaps ironically, perhaps paradoxically, today's transition more difficult than the one of 1989. Even though one would think that in historical terms, moving from communism to democracy obviously is something much more monumental and therefore should be more difficult than simply restoring democracy after this sad 8 years episode of populist authoritarianism. Unfortunately, it's not the case. First of all, today's transition operates in a in the environment of very deep polarization, both in the society and mainly in the among political elites. It may sound strange, but in fact, in 1989, Polish society was not all that polarized, because everyone knew, everyone felt, almost everyone, that the old system is not worth maintaining. And the least supportive of the old system were communists themselves, who were more than happy to accept and to collaborate with the new system under the guarantees of impunity and also for access to financial resources. But today is not the case. Today's polarization is much deeper. And this is what, again, political scientists call toxic polarization, which in my view is characterized by the following three characteristics. First of all, it is very deep. That is, the range of matters in which the views of warring parties overlap is more and more narrow. Secondly, it is negative in the sense that the dislike of the others is much more intense than the loyalty to its own favorite political party. And thirdly, it's moralized. That is not only about disagreement, but also it's about fundamental moral disapproval of the others, who are not simply mistaken in their political recipes, but who are bad people, immoral, they are traitors, and so on. So that's the first point, which makes today's polarization so deep. And this polarization, to a large extent, is driven by the elites rather than being bottom-up. There is a very good study by Polish-American scholar at Emory, Wojciech, who wrote this paper, excellent paper about the polarization sort of generated or triggered from above. So that leads to the second point, and that is that today's opposition doesn't identify any items and issues on which it would support and collaborate with the government elected in October 2023. So there isn't this situation in which we had in 1989, where people like General Kiszczak or Jaruzelski, in fact, acceded to the institutional structure emerging from the Round Table. And third problem, which I've been quite interested in my work and my studies on Polish populism, is that much of the most troubling and toxic aspects of this breakdown, of this constitutional and democratic breakdown, is to a large extent invisible. It is sort of obscure. And that is because this democratic backsliding, which started in late 2015 in Poland, after the double elections, the presidential election and then parliamentary election, was, first of all, incremental. It was very fast, but it took some time for various institutions to be captured by peace. For example, in the case of Constitutional Tribunal, it took exactly 1 year. It started in early December 2015, and more or less was completed in late December 2016, where Ms. Julia Przyłębska took over the chairmanship of the Constitutional Tribunal. And from then on, the tribunal became a submissive helper of the government. So 1 year, it's not overnight. It's not like your traditional coup d'etat, when you can identify a specific moment in which something very bad happens. Secondly, the worst, the most negative and toxic effects of this dismantlement were not related to one particular institution, but to the cumulative effects, to feedback between changes to different institutions, which rendered these effects to some extent invisible. Because if you looked at any particular institution, say the Supreme Court or the Senate, one at a time, it didn't seem particularly problematic. Well, what's the problem? Aren't you paranoid? Aren't you exaggerating? You know, okay, so they changed this and that. Similar things happen elsewhere. It was only the cumulative effect of the changes in different fields, something that is not easily visible to, say, a non-lawyer or non-specialist, which made this transition, this dismantlement of democracy so deep. And perhaps the most striking feature of this democratic erosion, something that Poland shares with many other of the countries which I have just mentioned, including India or Turkey, is that those changes operated without any fundamental institutional change, so that institutions remained seemingly the same, except that they have been hollowed up of their traditional function and meaning. And this concept of hollowing up requires some unpacking, because so far it is just a metaphor. And when we look at, situation in Poland, we can identify at least 5 categories of this hollowing up. The first is the simplest. It's capture of the institution. You just place your own people. You don't change anything about it in particular. The Constitutional Tribunal is the best, or if you like, the worst example of that. In the end, although during 2016, the ruling peace tried several new statutes which would fundamentally change the operation of the Constitutional Tribunal, and the tribunal, in some sort of existential self-defense, invalidated one after the other. Once they managed to get majority, peace that is, majority on the Constitutional Tribunal, they gave up with any changes and basically returned to the previous legislative status quo, because it was captured. These are now our people, not people over whom we have no control. Duplication is another strategy, institutional strategy. You maintain an institution, a constitution as it is, but you create a new institution by statute, which sort of shadows the original institution. Orban was very good at it in Hungary. In Poland, the good case of that type of strategy was with the broadcasting board. So in addition to a constitutional board, which had all sorts of guarantees of independence and neutrality, they've established the so-called National Media Council, which wasn't a constitutional institution because they didn't have constitutional majority. They couldn't amend the constitution, but which slowly took up many of the functions which were performed by the broadcasting board. Another is erosion of competences, erosion of budget. The Ombudsman Office was an example of it. The fourth one is what I call migration, but migration, as you say, in migrating files from one part of your online documents to another, so that an institution remained the same, but it was migrated. It was placed in a different institutional context with a completely different rules of dependence and accountability. And the example here was Public Prosecution Office, which from a semi-independent institution became simply part of the structure of Ministry of Justice, with Minister of Justice becoming ex officio the Prosecutor General or the Attorney General, to use American nomenclature. And the fifth one was about internal restructuring. So again, for the external observers, nothing changed. The institution exists as it was before, business as usual. But in fact, it's through internal restructuring, it's now completely different. The Supreme Court is an example of that, where some chambers were abolished by statutes, not because it's not a constitutional matter. Others were added, and those two new added chambers of the Supreme Court, under the new rules of operation of the National Council of Judiciary, as you see all these dots are connected with each other, were elected only by the votes of the majority in the parliament, that is, consists only of the loyalists of the ruling party. So that is, if you like, that is the background, which shows what are the circumstances inherited by the democratic majority in late 2023. And the best metaphor I can come up with is that of a minefield. The institutional structure in Poland is that of a minefield in which you have various institutions which are entrenched in a legal constitutional sense, that is, which are so strongly embedded into the system that you cannot simply change them by statutes. And therefore, they have a quasi-constitutional persistence, sort of power of persistence. They are entrenched either by the fact that to change them, you need a consent of the president, and the President Duda, until this May, is the strongest remnant of the ancien regime, and makes sure that some changes disliked by peace are not approved, or by the captured Constitutional Tribunal, which, although it's a facade body and does not correspond at all to the constitutional design of Constitutional Tribunal, nevertheless seemingly exists and invalidates one bill after another. So what does it mean in terms of the rule of law for the current majority? Because the rule of law features in the title of this lecture, and it is something about which I am particularly concerned. We may introduce another metaphor. The current government is in the situation of having to repair the ship a ship in the open sea. That is normal operations of all these institutions, of courts, of the Supreme Court, of Council of Judiciary, and in particular of the Public Prosecution Office, must go on. People do commit crimes. There are many issues which all these institutions have to perform. And yet, these institutions, being so deeply affected, contaminated, tainted by their illegality, have to be fundamentally changed. But how do you do it? How do you do it when, while at the same time maintaining the rule of law? Let me make one tiny personal digression. About 10 days ago, I was in Venice at a conference organized in conjunction with venerated institution called Venice Commission, which is the European Commission, formal name is European Commission for Democracy Through Law. And it's indeed an extremely important advisory body within the structure of Council of Europe, not European Union, Council of Europe, which provides advice. But this advice to governments that ask about it, or when the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe asks them to provide advice. And while until 2023, Venice Commission was extremely constructive and helpful in criticizing various governmental actions when it comes to public prosecution, courts, police acts, etc. The problem with them is that after 2023, they have issued several opinions, which I believe were mistaken and unhelpful. And it's not because they changed their views, just to the contrary. The problem is that they haven't changed their view while the circumstances changed. So the main mantra of Venice Commission is you cannot breach the rule of law if you want, when and if you want to restore the rule of law. Here is a sentence, a very typical sentence from one of the recent opinions on Poland of Venice Commission on a package of acts proposed to reform Constitutional Tribunal. So as the Venice Commission says, the Venice Commission emphasizes that any measure taken with a view to, quote unquote, restoring, I don't know why in quotation marks, but never mind, restoring the rule of law has to meet the overall requirements of the rule of law. And I told them, I think that this type of mantra, if you understand the rule of law in the way you do, in a very legalistic way, that is a full compliance with the existing legal rules in force, is unhelpful and actually is like a recipe for paralysis of the government. And because much of the laws enacted by peace government may be considered as statutory lawlessness. And we have a language for that. That is the language famously introduced by a great democratic liberal legal philosopher in Germany after the Second World War, Gustav Radbruch, who distinguished, looking back at the Third Reich law, he distinguished between what he called gesetzliches Unrecht, that is statutory non-law, and on the other hand, übergesetzliches Recht, that is supra-statutory law. And let me emphasize, I don't want to compare the peace period in Poland to the Third Reich. It would be ridiculous. It would be demeaning to all the victims of Hitler's era. But from that point of view, actually, it is reasonably useful conceptual framework that much of the non-democratic changes introduced in Polish law were unconstitutional if one looks at the spirit and letter of the Constitution, and also were contrary to the EU law. Except that there wasn't any constitutional court, or something like Supreme Court in this country, which would declare these changes unconstitutional, because Constitutional Tribunal became part of the problem and couldn't be a part of the solution. So what I've been suggesting in my writings and my public statements in Poland is that the only remedy, even though it may seem untidy, would be to appeal directly to the Constitution by any state body, and in particular by the Parliament. And the Parliament had issued several proclamations or resolutions, including one of 6 March 2024, for example, saying that the Constitutional Tribunal does not perform its constitutional functions. But somehow it stopped short of saying, therefore, it is not a true constitutional tribunal. And fortunately, more recently, it has undertaken some more practical steps, such as non-publishing of so-called constitutional tribunal judgments, something I applaud, and also non-filling of the vacancies on the constitutional tribunal, something that I applaud again, but something the Venice Commission disagrees with. And I said that openly, just as I'm saying now to you in this Venice Commission meeting, and I don't think it went very well. Went down very well. Okay, so these are the dilemmas, say the rule of law and constitutional main dilemmas in Poland today. And the person you see here is a person who I think probably he has the most difficult job in the world today. He's Polish Minister of Justice, Adam Bodnar. So I suggest that there are certain temptations which should be resisted. One temptation is acting out of the animus or revenge. Revenge is not a good advisor in politics, even when you have all sorts of good reasons to dislike the people from the ancien regime. Nor so-called militant democracy, like banning of political parties, which is part of the, if you like, arsenal of constitutional devices in Europe after the Second World War, remembering that much of the defeat or much of the failures of democracy were brought about by parties exploiting their democratic rights. But in Poland, we don't have a situation which would justify, which would warrant these sort of militant democracy rules. You cannot delegalize a party that 30% of your population agrees with, and which doesn't have in its program and even actual activities an aim of overturning democracy by violent means, which was the target of the traditional militant democracy justifications. What do you have to do? And here is why the current government, I think, has been less than satisfactory in its actions to restore the rule of law and democracy. You have to clearly distinguish between the individual and the institutional dimensions. Individual accountability cannot be achieved in any other way than by the traditional rules of legal procedures. You must have a prosecutor, you must have an indictment, you must have the court of the first instance, you must have the lawyer's aid. Then when you are sentenced, you must have a right to appeal. It must take time. And there cannot be any shortcuts. Poland tried to experiment with some shortcuts, such as so-called parliamentary commissions of investigation. And to be very gentle, it wasn't a great success. But this individual accountability, which must take time and which cannot be achieved overnight, is separate from institutional rebuilding or institutional reforms of the institutions. And that should have been done a long time ago. It's already 1 year and 3 months since this government controls the majority of the parliament, it could have, in my view, simply extinguished the so-called constitutional tribunal, sort of bite the bullet. You know, if you say that it does not correspond to constitutional design, why is it still there? And many people can use it as an argumentative asset for their defense against complying with the democratic government. What about the Council of Judiciary, which we know also from the Court of Justice of European Union judgments and ECHR, European Court of Human Rights, that this is not a judicial body because it doesn't have the advantages of political independence, etc. These institutions should not exist anymore and shouldn't have existed for quite a number of months. And the only, not justification, but explanation which I can find for this strange reticence of the current government in dealing with them is that this is, after all, a coalition government. And not every party, especially some of the slightly more conservative parties, such as PSL and Poland 2050, are much more hesitant in going ahead with the reforms that have to be introduced. Now, when I've been thinking about the overall situation in Poland, I think that behind all these small institutional things, legal things, which I have just said, there is a fundamental dilemma. And the dilemma, the conundrum which I see, is tension between two important values. Each of them is important, but very often there is a tension or even incompatibility between them. And these are values of depolarization on the one hand, and consolidation on the other hand. Depolarization in terms of some sort of reconciliation between the warring parties in the society, and on the other hand, consolidation of democratic institutions and democratic guarantees that the authoritarians will not return to power. And when I was thinking about it, I came across this wonderful, truly wonderful article by my current colleague at Princeton, Professor Sean Wylans, historian, in New York Review of Books. And Wylans there discussed the then public debate within the by and large democratic liberal field in the United States. It was early last year, so there were still several months before the election. And there was debate, as you may remember, about whether Donald Trump should be subjected to disqualification under the third section of 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. 14th Amendment is usually very well known because of the first section, equal protection of the laws. Very few people remember, except of legal historians, that it also has this third section, the disqualification section. And this third section says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. And there were some scholars, such as Mark Graeber of University of Maryland, who said, well, that actually fits very well this particular candidate, and so he should be disqualified. But then there were other people, scholars, experts, who said, let's not do that. That's a horrible recipe. The judgment on Donald Trump, then early last year, should be rendered by the electors, by the community. That's the only way in democracy, not by courts. And this particular amendment, they claimed, probably falsely, was sort of like one-off solution, only to deal with the Confederates after the Civil War. So I came across this article of Sean Wyland's, and there is a passage, and I'm coming soon to an end of this lecture, this passage which sort of struck me, because it gave me this insight that this is precisely what I'm concerned about in thinking about Poland today, this tension between the values of depolarization and consolidation. So Wyland says this: contrary to some of the pundits, and he had in mind, for example, people like Professor Sam Moyn, a left-wing legal professor at Yale, contrary to them, the 14th Amendment, including its third section, was not adopted to conciliate the North and South. Along with the 13th and 15th Amendments, so-called three Reconstruction Amendments, it was an attempt to formalize and consolidate a social revolution, the abolition of slavery, and as far as possible to crush in national law the implacable efforts of the defeated Confederates to undo that revolution. And then he goes on to say, it grew from the debates on how best to ensure that the chief Confederates would not recreate an oligarchic regime based on black subjugation and disenfranchisement. And toute proportion gardée, or mutatis mutandis, or whatever, we know that all the analogies to some extent may be misleading. I think that's precisely the sort of dilemma that we have in Poland. Should we try to conciliate between us and them, which in abstract terms is a good thing, which is probably a necessary thing for democracy, try to find some consensus, but in the process give up on some necessary consolidation measures which will be resented by them because it will affect their vested interests. So this is the conundrum which exists in Poland today. And it is replicated in the debates about the rule of law, which I have just referred to. And it is replicated in these unfortunate opinions of the of the Venice Commission, the opinions which are weaponized in Polish political game and used against any attempts of bringing about systemic solutions. For example, to the question of so-called neo-judges, that is, judges appointed or promoted with the inclusion of this new unconstitutional Council of Judiciary. What to do with them? Venice Commission says you must do it on a case-by-case basis. There are some 2,000 neo-judges in Poland. I mean, it will take a long time. According to the estimate of Ministry of Justice, it will take until 2030. In the meantime, we will have 2027, the next election. And I believe that if the government doesn't sort out this mess, this chaos which exists in Polish judiciary, in 2027, the electorate will issue a very, very harsh grade to this government. So to end my lecture, and there will be a very short postscript later, but to end my lecture, I would say that to various descriptions or conceptions of democracy, which are popular in political science, like we may have liberal democracy and illiberal democracy, we may have representative democracy and direct democracy, we may have deliberative democracy, we may have participatory democracy, etc. I would like to add, and to copyright, if I may, a new concept, a concept of Sisyphean democracy, which looks like that. And this is, unfortunately, a sad symbol of what the government today, with the best intentions in the world, has to deal with because of this landmine situation left by the incumbents, by the predecessors who did it especially for that particular purpose, that if they lose election, the next majority will be unable to undo much of this destruction and therefore undermine their vested interest. Let me add 2 minutes of a postscript, because it may seem that today, in mid-March 2025, to talk about Polish democracy without mentioning Donald Trump is a little bit like talk about something with the elephant in the room, which we pretend doesn't exist. So I would like to say that, and this is a very simplistic, primitive account, that there are at least 3 ways in which the first weeks and months of policy of Donald Trump in the United States affect adversely democracy in Poland. The first one is that the rapprochement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, to the detriment of Ukraine and Zelensky, may lead to a direct existential threat to Poland, not just to Polish democracy, but to Poland. Because if the end result will be that Russians will install some pro-Putin government in Kiev, we will have an enemy with a very, very long border frontier with Ukraine if it becomes pro-Russia. The whole strategic situation of Poland will become so much worse. The second reason is that any enhancement, any empowerment of the extreme right wing in Europe, which is anti-EU, and we are talking about Front National, now Rassemblement National in France, or Vox Party in Spain, or Fratelli and Lega in Fratelli to a less degree, but certainly Lega of Salvini in Italy, etc., that it will greatly weaken the European Union. And of course, we know that both President Trump and Vice President Vance are much more supportive of these forces than of the mainstream liberal democratic parties in Europe. There was an attempt under the auspices of Poland, in particular then Prime Minister Morawiecki, to build some sort of European international alliance of these extreme right-wing forces in in Europe. It was discontinued, of course, after the full-scale invasion of Putin in February 2023. Now it may be recreated. And of course, it will greatly strengthen the authoritarians in Poland, and that's bad for Poland. And the third reason is of a different category and salience of importance, but it is also important. To some extent, it is maybe dictated by my own experience, because personal disclosure, I am on a governing bodies of 2 major Polish NGOs, out of 3 biggest Polish NGOs, Institute of Public Affairs and Helsinki Foundation of Human Rights. And a few weeks ago, both these institutions received from USAID in Washington an urgent demand to discontinue any disbursement of funds. And USAID has been absolutely crucial for the operation of civil society, not just in Poland, but also elsewhere. And in particular, it concerned actions such as support for mainly Ukrainian women and children in Poland. Without that, our actions will be largely paralyzed. And since civil society has been so important in general in the restoration of democracy in Poland and in the fight for restoration of democracy in Hungary, then these changes are actually quite dramatic. And I'm sorry to finish on such a sad note, but these are sad and difficult times. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this lecture, Professor Sadurski. We have two microphones on your left and right, and I invite people who would like to ask questions to go behind the microphone. I will ask that you please introduce yourself and ask for brief questions. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for this this inspiring talk. My name is Agnieszka Mrozik. I'm a scholar in the Polish Academy of Sciences, but here I'm also a senior Dajan Wiedźiński fellow at the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. And using the opportunity that we have you here and that I can ask you a question, I would like to raise maybe three very brief issues. So, questions, problems. So I would like to ask, where do you see, where are the women's reproductive rights on this map that you has just drawn for us? Because for me, there is one more similarity between post-1989 and post-2023 transitions in Poland that I would call selling women's rights. And the new government promised us a lot and did not do much. So that's one thing. Another thing is a question, how would you evaluate some movements by the new government that even peace did not introduce? And here I mean Prime Minister Donald Tusk's proposition to suspend the right to shelter, to asylum for refugees that are escaping war and conflicts in the countries that peace did not suggest such a thing, and we heard it from Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And the third thing is, you said that now we are much stronger. I mean, Poland is much stronger than we used to be in 1989 because now we are members of the EU. But in that context, how would you evaluate, what would you say about avoiding by the current government certain recommendations by EU, like in the field of employment contracts, like, for example, for example, postponing the enactment of regulations that will introduce payment of health and pension contributions on contracts of mandate. I think it's quite specific, but that's,
Thank you very much. These are all very, very important issues when it comes to women's reproductive. I mean, I think fully agree with the underlying premises of each of these three questions. I find it absolutely inexcusable for the government not to undertake a serious legislative attempt of fulfilling its electoral promise, which is that the abortion up to 12 weeks of pregnancy would be fully permissible. And that would be just a good starting point to think in a more comprehensive way about women's reproductive rights. The usual excuses are two. A, Duda will not sign it. Well, let's try. Let's not abandon any important reform promised in the electoral campaign, having the excuse of Duda. It will be Duda's problem then. And second is that the coalition partners will not agree. Well, what's the good of a coalition where matters which are so fundamental cannot be agreed upon? So I think that these both arguments are more pretextual and excuses rather than good justification. I wholeheartedly agree with you about the premise of the second question. For this government to formally lift, what's the word, cancel, suspend rather, to formally suspend for I think now 6 months, granting, even taking requests for a right to asylum is completely inexcusable. It is the sort of populism of the worst kind. It's fortunately not accompanied by authoritarian populism, but it's probably more populist than what peace did. So it can only be seen as an attempt to solidify social support in the situation of the declining popularity of the government. About the EU recommendations which you mentioned, I haven't had, so I cannot really comment on it. I feel that when it comes to the general relationship between this government and the EU, there are some major problems, and one of the major problems for me is the negative vote of civic platform, PO, MEPs, members of European Parliament, about plans for treaty reform, which would expand the range of majority vote rather than unanimity within the EU. Somehow for Tusk government and his members of parliament to be against these necessary reforms, and we see now especially when we need to start thinking seriously about EU as a defense agreement, is inexcusable. So I'm the last person who would defend Tusk on any of these three issues.
We will take a question here first.
Thank you, Professor Sadurski, for this important and insightful lecture. I'm Christina Daugertis. I'm on the faculty at the law school. And I wanted to try to defend the Venice Commission in response to your critique. So I take quite seriously your position that there is a risk of losing the next election in 2027. And what I imagine the Venice Commission might say in response to your concern, to your very serious concern, is yes, we hear you, but the risk is of making a loss even graver if the current government loses the legitimacy, the standing to attack or to criticize attacks on the rule of law by having engaged in the same form of behavior. And so I wonder how you think about not just the risk of losing an election, but what comes next and whether that kind of argument is persuasive to you. I guess I wonder also, is the choice that you presented between consolidation and depolarization quite so stark? Or are there ways to perhaps try to do some of both? And I am thinking perhaps about models like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I'm thinking maybe about taking, working from the playbook of peace, right? Parallel institutions. Are some of these incremental, less visible, less directly confrontational moves perhaps a more appealing alternative to a confrontation that makes the current government susceptible to the criticism that they're no different from peace when it comes to respect for the rule of law?
Thank you very much, Professor. These are very, very important points. Let me start with the Venice Commission. Of course, this is exactly as they would respond. We don't want, in the process for having some maybe short-term gains, to have these fundamental long-term losses. That is that the government will simply perpetuate the worst excesses and abuses of the former government. But I think there is no symmetry there. And I think that, if you like, on details, they are actually wrong. And we have, in these cases on which Venice Commission issues its opinions, we have some very, very dramatic short to mid-term problems, which needs to be solved right now. So there is a problem with the neo-judges, judges who voluntarily stood for promotion or appointment by a council, which they knew very well is considered by majority of lawyers unconstitutional. And then it was confirmed by both judgment of the ECJ and ECHR. And so they say, by the way, in accordance with the advice or with the views of the Polish Helsinki Foundation, they say, we cannot have here collective guilt type. We have to look at each of these judges taken separately. But not only because of contingent matters of the time. It would take many, many years. But also as a matter of principle. They all committed the same offense against judicial integrity. They wanted to have a shortcut career change using this unconstitutional body. What else do you need to scrutinize? You know, if the problem was systemic, and it was systemic by the structure of this new council, then the solutions also would have to be systemic rather than on a case-by-case basis. In the opinion about the Constitutional Tribunal, they said, you cannot stop publishing judgments, except those judgments in which you have those the judges improperly appointed. Because by doing it, you'll be repeating what the government of Beata Szydło did in 2016 and 17. They also haven't published judgment. But I think it's a false symmetry. Then it was a real constitutional tribunal. Now for all sorts of reasons, not just because we dislike their judgments, but because they have been so deeply tainted, contaminated by their illegitimacy, this is not a real constitutional tribunal. So why publish something that is non-judgment as a judgment, etc. So these are very real problems, and I agree with you that often, perhaps we should try to balance and find some trade-offs between the one and the other. That is, between consolidation and depolarization. But if we have specific issues such as these, then I think, at least my view is, I think we should give priority and precedence to consolidation. Because if we don't consolidate democracy, then the same things will repeat in future. And your second question was about, your second comment, sorry.
So you addressed it in part, was whether this choice between consolidation and depolarization is in fact so stark.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm Andrzej Wierzbicki, I'm a faculty member here at UOM, and thank you for a fascinating lecture. You talked a lot about juridical appointments, and I'm hoping that you could help me understand the issue. So judges here in the US are appointed by the political branch, either by the president confirmed by the Senate, or here in Michigan elected in an election. Many European countries also appoint judges with the political branch involvement. But in Poland, and that's democratic. But in Poland, the only democratic way apparently is to appoint judges by cooptation, by previously appointed judges. But many of those judges have been nominated by Rada Państwa, can be traced back to the communist system. So could you clarify why?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there are different systems of judicial appointments around the world. And when there are systems, such as in the United States, that federal judges are appointed through, by and large, political procedure, and some state judges are elected by the general population, there are some measures of the system, and one has to look at it holistically, which would protect their independence. So same in Canada, you know, where judges of the Supreme Court are appointed by the government, or in Australia too. But there are certain unwritten rules built into the political culture of Canada and Australia that you do not appoint judges who are clearly underqualified because you like their politics. It simply doesn't happen there. All continental European systems, if I remember well, maybe there are one or two exceptions, but all continental European systems have a system of councils of judiciary, which are composed of various constituencies and which are not merely, as you suggested, co-optation, but which also involve representatives of the parliament and representatives of the executive. So traditionally in Poland, which more or less here imitated the dominant pattern of continental Europe, was that there is this National Council of Judiciary, where you have 15 judges and 10 other persons ex officio. Some are nominated by the president, some are elected by the parliament. Then there is the president, the first Chief Justice of Supreme Court, who ex officio is also president of this council, etc. So it was a mixed system, but you're absolutely right. The idea is that 15 out of 25 members of the council are judges. And until 2015, it was considered a very strong unwritten rule, which actually preceded the Constitution, which stemmed from the Round Table agreements of 1989, that those judges, since they are representatives of judges, are elected by judges. One may call it co-optation, but they are not co-opted by judges who were before on the council. There was a very complex rules about different levels of courts and different types of courts having certain quota, certain number of positions on this board. And it worked in a way which maybe it's typical that the countries which have recent memories of judges being employed for purely political reasons, including in fascist regimes, in Italy, in France, in the Vichy system in France, in Germany, that you need some other mechanism of selecting judges. Now, constitutional court judges are still a different category, because Poland is only one of 3 countries in the world which has constitutional court judges elected by the parliament. The other 2 are Hungary and Germany. But in Germany, they need qualified majority, so that drives or requires a degree of consensus between all parties in the parliament, including between the ruling coalition and the opposition. Poland is just simple majority, so is the system of winner takes all. So is in Hungary. So in that sense, I believe that once you have a certain institutional design, either in a good democratic system, like in Canada or the United States, it builds some extra non-legal guarantees for independence, which are in the political culture, or you have strong institutional design, such as everywhere in continental Europe. And there is something called European Network of Council of Judiciary, and they expelled actually Polish council, saying, well, this is not the body which we recognize as similar to us. Whether there are still some judges appointed in the time by Rada Państwa, that is from the communist system, look, they stopped, this body stopped operating in 1989. What would be the age of these judges today? I mean, we are talking about people who probably are well into retirement age. So I don't think, okay, occasionally there are in public media or in media now of the opposition, some individual names which sound like a parade of horribles in which you have someone appointed by a communist body, but the time makes a difference, the passage of time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was very informative. My name is Emmanuel Verdonis. I'm a senior here at the University of Michigan, and I'm also a dual citizen of the U.S. and from the European Union. So I have a vested.
And from where? Sorry.
In the European Union. I'm a dual citizen of America and Greece.
Yes.
So I feel like I have a vested interest in understanding what's going on in other European Union countries. My question for you would be over the strategy that some national parties have enacted to try to push back against more authoritarian or populist-minded parties in the European Union. That would be the cordon sanitaire systems, like we saw in Germany with Merz trying to work with the SPD, and we saw recently in the French elections with Emmanuel Macron and the Republican Front. Do you believe that this strategy is effective in trying to push back against the influence and power of these populist parties trying to come into government, or do you believe it's more of a temporary stopgap, like how we've seen in Austria with the Freedom Party, them being shut out of government and increasing in support as of recently?
Thank you. There are different strategies, and it is all very context sensitive. So I think that an idea of cordon sanitaire is a good idea. I mean, you try to, not so much not to talk to them, but not to enter into any arrangements with parties which are anti-systemic. Another way, which is much more controversial and doubtful, would be to take up some of their demands, maybe those less dangerous demands, and mainstream them into your own policies. That was, for example, the case of the former Dutch Prime Minister, whose name I have forgotten for a moment.
Mark Rutte?
Yeah, Mark Rutte, exactly, yes. There is a whole catalogue of possible strategies of countering right-wing authoritarians. I believe that in Poland, for example, a cordon sanitaire around peace would be a good strategy. It is, of course, strongly polarizing strategy, but I have already revealed my antipathy to a strong depolarization, and I believe that occasionally, in the exceptional circumstances such as now in Poland, even the cost of furthering polarization would be good in order to keep certain cordon sanitaire around them, especially now in Poland, where you have two anti-systemic parties, not just peace, law and justice, but also so-called confederation, which is, to use an analogy, some sort of Polish equivalent of Jobbik, I guess, in Hungary. Or, it's even more to the right than peace. This cordon sanitaire is very important, because if not, this, at least peace, will try to win some of the, call it moderate or middle of the political spectrum voters, based on various failures of Tusk government, such as this mentioned here before. And since I believe that it would be a total tragedy and disaster for Poland to have any of these parties elect their candidate in the presidential election this May, even more so to win in the parliamentary elections in 2027, I believe almost all means, except for unlawful means, to contain the advancement of these parties are justified. But not all means, of course, not delegalization. I think party bans are simply have no place today in a country like Poland, where you don't have parties which advocate violence to overturn democracy.
Thank you so much.
We have time for one last question, a brief one, please, and I will ask for also a brief response on your part.
All right, Thomas Moiner from the law school as well. So I do my PhD on judicial independence in the context of the European Union. And so I was wondering about, oh, sorry.
You are so tall that you need to put...
Sorry about that. So you ended on this kind of pessimistic, negative note. And I was wondering if this is actually true, because I'm a German citizen. So I was wondering if this is not a reawakening of Europe, or kind of if Trump and Putin could in the end be right, or if it works the other way around, because we see the UK back, Keir Starmer is very active in this sense, and as I understand, Polish people are very pro-European, so if this threat against Russia might not even help to consolidate. And the other one is tied to an earlier one. So in your model, I agree that in this situation, not the same rules can apply for rebuilding, but how do you then generate trust and legitimacy to actually pursue these kind of measures you want to take?
Sure. Thank you very much. That's These are very, very important dilemmas. So yes, if one tries, and we all should, because we cannot finish this beautiful evening on such a very negative note. So if we want to find some silver lining, or something positive about the current situation, it is exactly as you are saying, and that is that Trump's policy may be a strong trigger for renewing solidarity among Europeans and to build, and to let them also build a strong defense force and defense alliance. It also has an added advantage of sort of bringing back the UK without their formally renouncing Brexit. We already see that that happens, and that the UK is a very important actor in this consolidated front in Europe. The problem is about the time perspective. The problem is temporal, and that is that it takes years and years to build a much more united European Union. I'm an EU federalist. I believe there should be United States of Europe. But I know that in terms of time horizon, it is a matter for decades. Maybe now, under these new requirements, of years, but long years. In the meantime, Ukraine may die. Okay? In the meantime, Putin may even strengthen its hold, I don't know, over the Baltic states. If President Trump abandons the traditional understanding of Article 5 of NATO alliance and says, yeah, but it applies only to countries which, in my view, contribute to the costs, to the military costs properly, then the Baltics may be next in the line. You know, when President Trump will start negotiating, we'll defend you if you sell us Vilnius or whatever, or Riga. You know, these are nice towns. You know, and I can build beautiful hotels there. What about Moldova? You know, and so on. So it's a very, very long period to build. There was recently a debate in the European Parliament, I'm sure you're aware of it, about the change of treaties under which decisions about armed forces would be taken by majority, by qualified majority, rather than by unanimity. And there is a very strong opposition against it. Of course, the European Parliament does not decide about it, but we already saw that all those Eurosceptical parties will be against. And this would be just one very, very, very early step on the way to build such a Europe which could be truly capable of being a strong deterrent force for Putin. And your last observation is extremely true. And that is that, yes, Polish society is very pro-EU and pro-European. And many of the actions of Tusk, of the sort that I advocated here, may result in the decline of support for him and the decline of legitimacy. But when I think about these things, I always think, you know, but then there is also another actor, and that are people who trust Tusk and who voted for him. And this trust is not unlimited. It's not unconditional. So what about the women's rights, which he promised? You know, I mean, what about the general repair to the democracy system, which he promised? He may, by abandoning these promises, he may win some moderately right-wing voters, but he'll certainly lose many of his traditional supporters on the left and in the center. So in terms of a calculus of legitimacy, it is like a zero-sum game. You know, you lose some, you win some, but you may lose others. And I think he should very seriously think about his traditional base.
Professor Sadurski, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you once again to all of you for coming. Thank you.